The air still carried that damp, metallic smell from last night's rain, the kind that sticks in your clothes and seeps into your skin. I'd gone out early, coffee in one hand, property survey folded in my back pocket. It was a ritual of mine. Walk the boundary lines of my land a couple of times a year, make sure everything was in order. My parents taught me that. Land isn't just dirt, my father used to say. It's proof you exist somewhere. I reached the southern edge, where the old cedar posts ran like a spine along the lot. Only this morning, the spine was broken. There it stood, a brand new concrete wall smooth as poured glass, stretching right over the property marker like it never existed. It wasn't a small misstep either. This was deliberate. I knew my land well enough to walk it blindfolded, and that wall had no business being where it stood. I stopped, took a slow breath, and let my eyes travel up the structure. Fresh mortar lines, still pale from curing, the kind of precision you only get when someone throws a lot of money at it. My gaze followed the wall toward the driveway, and that's when I saw him. Clive Dawson, my neighbor. Lean frame, slick hair combed back like he'd just stepped out of a magazine ad. He was crouched beside a cherry-red Lamborghini, polishing the hood in tight, deliberate circles. Not a speck of dirt dared land on that car. His garage doors stood wide open, revealing the rest of his expensive shrine. A fleet of cars most people only see on posters. A black McLaren, a silver Aston Martin, something under a dust cover that hinted at another prize. He noticed me, though he didn't stand, just glanced over, eyes hidden behind mirrored sunglasses, then turned his attention back to the hood. "You built this on my property," I said, calm, almost conversational. He didn't pause his polishing. "What are you going to do about it?" The words slid out slow, coated in that kind of arrogance only money and misplaced confidence can buy. Then, the smirk. Small, sharp, and deliberate. It wasn't the kind of smirk that comes from being genuinely amused. No. This was the kind that says, "I already won. You just haven't figured it out yet." I didn't answer him, not then. Just let my eyes rest on his sunglasses, wondering if the reflection he saw in them looked as unbothered as I felt. My father always told me there's power in the silence between words. People mistake it for weakness, but silence gives them space to fill with their own fears. Clive chuckled, a short, self-satisfied sound, and turned back to his car like I wasn't worth another second. I could have argued, could have told him about the survey map in my pocket, the boundary markers buried deep in the soil, the municipal records that backed every inch I owned. But why hand him my cards when he thought I had none? Instead, I walked the rest of the line, coffee warming my hand, eyes scanning every detail. The wall ran straight into the easement, right over the spot where runoff from our side of the neighborhood drained after heavy rains. That strip wasn't just mine, it was regulated. By the time I looped back toward my porch, Clive had rolled his car into the garage and shut the doors. The street was quiet except for the faint hiss of water running down the gutter. Inside my head, the math was already ticking. Construction permits, zoning laws, easement protections. I knew every regulation in this part of the city, not because I wanted to be the neighborhood watchdog, but because I'd spent my life as a civil engineer. I designed structures that lasted lifetimes, built on rules people like Clive thought didn't apply to them. As I stepped onto my porch, I looked back once more at that fresh concrete wall cutting across my property like a scar. He thought my silence was defeat, but silence in the right hands is the sound of the ground shifting under someone's feet. And Clive Dawson didn't even know the tremor had started. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, like it was holding on to something it didn't want to let go. I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee cooling beside me, staring at the keyring in my hand. On it was the small brass key I hadn't used in years, the one to the locked cabinet in my study. That cabinet wasn't for valuables in the usual sense. No cash, no jewelry, just paper, maps, contracts, photographs, proof of things people tend to forget until they need to remember. I turned the key, the lock clicking open with a sound that felt older than it was. Inside, stacked neatly, were the survey documents from when I'd bought the property 18 years ago, and a few older ones from my father's time. The paper was stiff, edges yellowing. I laid them out on the desk, smoothing them under my palms. Every line, every angle, every number burned into my memory long before this moment. The southern boundary was unmistakable. Cedar posts set precisely on the municipal survey line, running parallel to the old drainage ditch. That ditch wasn't just a neighborhood quirk. It was part of a regulated stormwater management system, which meant two things. One, it was my land. Two, it was protected by city ordinance. Still, memory isn't evidence, measurements are. I went out to the shed and pulled my laser measure from its case, along with the steel survey rod my father used to keep for just in case. The grass squished under my boots as I walked to the original cedar marker. I set the rod in place, the point biting into the damp earth, and aimed the laser toward the edge of Clive's fresh wall. The beam bounced back with a clean reading. I took it twice more, each time from different angles, each time steadying my breath before pressing the button. 7 feet, not 6.5, not close enough to call it even. Exactly 7 feet into my lot. I stood there for a moment, staring at the number on the screen, my thumb brushing over the cool metal of the device. 7 feet doesn't sound like much until you consider what it means here. A cut into land that drains the lower third of the block during a storm. Block that flow and the water has to go somewhere else, usually into basements. I crouched, running my fingers along the base of the wall where the concrete met the soil. The forms had been pulled clean, the edges sharp. No sign of erosion yet, but it was only a matter of time. They'd poured this fast, too fast, and without the proper setback. It didn't just look wrong, it was wrong. I straightened, looking down the length of it. The wall didn't stop at the garage. It ran like a knife into the heart of that easement, choking off a channel the city paid to maintain. Inside my head, the voiceover wrote itself. That strip wasn't just mine, it was protected. Protected meant there were rules. Protected meant there were consequences. Protected meant Clive Dawson had done more than insult me with that smirk. He'd picked a fight with a city department that had more lawyers on staff than he had cars in his garage. Back inside, I spread the maps on the dining table, overlaying the old survey with the updated aerial photo I'd printed from the city's GIS database. The intrusion was plain, like watching a scar appear across an old photograph. I penciled the measurements into the margin, underlining them twice. My father always told me, "Don't trust memory, don't trust talk. Trust the math." As I worked, I found myself replaying yesterday's scene in my head. Clive's sunglasses, the smug tilt of his head, the way he went back to polishing his car like I was just background noise. I imagined him leaning back in one of those leather chairs in his oversized garage, sipping some imported whiskey, thinking I'd spend the next few weeks grumbling to myself until I either gave up or forgot. He had no idea I'd already started a file, no idea that the moment I saw that wall I knew exactly where this road led. Because in my world, the fastest way to move something that doesn't belong is to let the people in charge know it shouldn't be there. And unlike Clive, I didn't need to ask what someone was going to do about it. I already knew. When Clive Dawson first rolled into the neighborhood 2 years ago, it was with the sort of arrival you couldn't ignore. 3 flatbeds showed up the same morning, each hauling a different luxury car, a cherry red Ferrari, a vintage Aston Martin, and something German and angular I didn't bother learning the name of. He parked them diagonally across his new driveway like trophies on display, and by noon, half the street had wandered over to see the new guy with the cars. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand. First impressions stick with me, and his was clear. The man wanted an audience. Within a week, contractors were crawling all over his property. The remodel started without so much as a whisper to the HOA, hammering at odd hours, floodlights blazing past midnight, cement trucks idling loud enough to rattle windows at 5:30 in the morning. When I asked him once, politely, if he could keep the noise down, he smiled like I'd just told him my deepest insecurity and said, "You'll get used to it." I didn't. One afternoon I came home to find my hedges, the old boxwoods my wife and I planted the year we moved in, trimmed into stiff, unnatural cubes, not just neatened up, cut back harsh with ragged edges like they'd been hacked by someone in a hurry. I followed the trail of clippings right to Clive's driveway, where his landscaping crew was loading gear into a trailer. Clive stood nearby, giving them a thumbs up. When I asked him why his crew was on my side of the property line, he shrugged. They were uneven. Figured I'd save you the trouble. That was the first time I felt that low burn of anger in my chest. Not because of the plants, they'd grow back, but because of the assumption, the casual dismissal, the message under his words. Your property, my decision. Then came the access road incident. The neighborhood's western lots shared a narrow strip of gravel road, technically an easement, that ran behind our homes and out to the main road. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. Delivery trucks, utility repairs, and, in my case, hauling out storm debris without blocking the main street. One morning, I drove back there to find a moving truck wedged sideways across the easement, blocking both directions. Not an accident. It was parked deliberately, with stacks of Clive's patio furniture filling the gap like a barricade. His workers were unloading boxes, chatting in the shade, and ignoring the fact that my truck was idling 10 feet away. When I honked, Clive emerged from behind the truck wearing mirrored sunglasses and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Won't be long," he said, and turned his back on me. I sat there for 40 minutes before they finally cleared the road. By then, I knew what kind of neighbor I was dealing with. The kind who believed rules were for other people. The kind who took space, physical, social, and otherwise, as a matter of habit. Socially, he was just as strategic. Clive knew exactly how to work a crowd, and he set his sights on the HOA board almost immediately. Within months, he was throwing loud, sprawling parties, the sort where the music thumps in your chest from 2 houses away, and making sure the right people from the board got prime seating, expensive drinks, and their photos taken beside those cars. It worked. At meetings, his infractions became misunderstandings, his fines became warnings. He cultivated allies who would nod sympathetically when anyone brought up complaints about him, then steer the conversation toward community spirit and letting small things slide. I learned to keep my distance, but I didn't forget the pattern. Every incident went into a quiet mental file. Noise, property damage, access issues, influence games, they all pointed in the same direction. Clive was a man who moved through life assuming that no one would stop him, and if they tried, he'd charm or bully his way past them. But charm doesn't pour concrete 7 feet over a property line, and bullying doesn't work on the right kind of paper trail. Looking back now, I realized the garage wasn't the beginning of our conflict. It was just the point where years of tension finally broke the surface. I caught Clive in the late afternoon, the sun slanting low enough to bounce hard off the chrome of his Aston Martin. He was leaning against the hood like it was an extension of himself, polishing it with slow, theatrical circles. I'd been pacing my living room for half an hour, weighing whether to have this conversation now or let it stew a few days. In the end, I decided sooner was better. "Clive," I called as I stepped onto the edge of his driveway, careful to stay on my side of the property line. He glanced up, one eyebrow raised, but didn't stop polishing. "Elliot." His tone was friendly enough to pass in polite company, but I'd lived here long enough to hear the boredom underneath. I kept my voice level. "I've been looking over some old survey records. I think we should review the property line together. There's an overlap." That got his attention, though not in the way I'd hoped. He stopped rubbing the car, set down the cloth, and straightened up slowly, like an actor hitting his mark. "Overlap," he repeated, drawing the word out. "Yes," I said. "About 7 feet onto my lot and into the stormwater drainage easement, which—" He cut me off with a sharp laugh. "Elliot, it's just a garage wall. Nobody cares about 7 feet." I felt my jaw tighten, but I didn't let it show. "The county might care, and the HOA—" "Forget the HOA," he said, waving his hand like he was swatting away a fly. "You think they'll go against me over a few inches of concrete?" 7 feet, I corrected, keeping my tone even. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. 7 feet, 7 inches. Doesn't matter. You challenge it, I'll bury you in legal fees before you can say easement. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've seen the cars in my garage, Elliot. You think I can't outlast you in court?" There it was, the real Clive. No pretense, no neighborly veneer. Just the smug certainty of a man who believed money was the only law that mattered. I let a small smile creep across my face, not wide enough to be mistaken for agreement, just enough to register as something he couldn't quite read. "I hear you," I said, loud and clear. "Good," he said, stepping back toward his car. "Now, let's not waste each other's time with this nonsense." I turned and walked away, slow and deliberate, the gravel under my shoes crunching loud in the still air. If he was watching me, and I'd bet he was, I wanted him to see nothing but calm in my posture. No hurry. No flinch. Inside, though, my mind was running hot. Every word he'd just said was a gift. His dismissal, his threat, the way he'd brushed off the easement like it was nothing. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calculating. Here's the thing Clive didn't know. I'd spent my career as a municipal planning consultant. My work was the reason certain roads existed, the reason certain developments got greenlit, and the reason others got strangled in red tape until they collapsed under their own financing. I knew zoning code better than most county employees. I knew the chain of approvals, the backdoor communications, and exactly how long it took to turn a nobody cares violation into a front-page demolition order. When Clive threatened to bury me in legal fees, I almost laughed out loud. You can't bury someone who's already building the hole you're going to fall into. I reached my back porch and leaned against the railing, letting the late-day sun hit my face. Outwardly, I looked like a man letting something go, deciding it wasn't worth the trouble. But inside, I was already mapping the next steps. Step 1. Verify the encroachment with an independent surveyor. Step 2. Document the easement violation with photographs, timestamps, and official coordinates. Step 3. File a quiet inquiry with the county's stormwater management division, letting them discover the issue without my name attached. Clive thought the garage was untouchable because he poured the concrete himself and parked expensive toys behind its walls. What he didn't understand, or maybe refused to, was that this wasn't about me versus him, it was about him versus the law, and the law, once it wakes up, doesn't care what's in your driveway. I pushed off the railing and went inside. Kelly was in the kitchen, painting in the golden light that spilled through the windows. She looked up at me with that quiet perceptiveness she's always had. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Perfect," I said, pouring myself a glass of water. "Better than perfect." She tilted her head. That smile. I shrugged, trying not to give too much away. Just thinking about how sometimes the fastest way to win is to let the other guy believe he already has. Clive thought I'd walked away in defeat. In truth, I'd just left the starting line, and he'd handed me the gun to fire the first shot. The next morning, I was in the county zoning office before most of the staff had finished their coffee. I'd been there hundreds of times over the years in my consulting days, and the building still smelled faintly of dust and printer toner, the scent of slow, bureaucratic inevitability. I signed the visitor log, nodding at the clerk behind the counter. She didn't recognize me, which was perfect. I wasn't here as Elliot from down the street. I was here as an anonymous property owner with a routine inquiry. "Need to pull the zoning maps for parcel 46B, I said casually. "And if possible, the most recent overlays for stormwater control." She tapped at her keyboard, printed a request slip, and waved me toward the public records room. I slipped inside, the door shutting with a muffled click. The maps were arranged in wide drawers, their heavy handles cold against my fingers. I pulled the one I needed and laid it flat on the table under the fluorescent lights. The boundaries were unmistakable. My property line running clean and straight, and just beyond it, a shaded strip marked in blue cross hatch. Stormwater control zone. That strip wasn't decorative, it was the county's insurance policy against flooding, erosion, and a dozen other headaches. It had legal weight, carved into ordinances that were as inflexible as bedrock, and Clive's garage. It sat like a tumor, jutting well into that protected area. I pulled my phone from my pocket and snapped a series of photos, full map, close-up of the blue zone, and one with my finger marking where his foundation crossed the line. Then I opened the online database and started searching past enforcement cases. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Case number 17-042. A homeowner had extended a patio 6 feet into a stormwater easement. No structure, no roof, just pavers. The county had ordered full removal within 60 days. Case number 19-117. A detached shed partially overlapping a control zone. Demolition ordered. Owner fined $4,200 for non-compliance. Case number 21-305. A fence line moved 4 feet into the easement. The county not only ordered it removed, but billed the owner for the cruise time. Compared to these, Clive's monstrosity wasn't a minor oversight. It was a flagrant middle finger to the regulations. The garage wall wasn't a fence or a patio. It was a poured concrete structure with electrical, plumbing, and foundation footings sunk deep into restricted soil. If the county came down on him, and they would, it wouldn't be a polite letter. It would be a demolition order. And once that order was in place, it wouldn't matter how many sports cars sat inside. They'd be towed or pushed out before the first hammer hit the wall. I sat back in my chair, letting the implications sink in. This wasn't just about reclaiming 7 feet of grass. This was about turning the smug grin he'd worn in his driveway into the tight-lipped stare of a man watching hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, vanish in rubble and dust. And yet, I didn't feel giddy. Not yet. The satisfaction would come later. For now, this was business. I gathered the copies I'd printed, map overlays, case files, highlighted ordinance sections, and slid them into a plain manila envelope. My name wasn't on any of it. There was no need to leave a trail. Walking out of the building, I kept my head down. The winter air was sharp, carrying the faint smell of rain. Stormwater season. The irony didn't escape me. Back home, I spread the documents across my kitchen table. The evidence was airtight. All it needed was the right trigger, the right office to discover it at the right time. But I wasn't going to rush. Timing was everything. I thought about Clive, about the way he'd leaned toward me and whispered about burying me in legal fees. I thought about his polished garage floor, the framed photos of himself at car shows, the way he treated property lines as optional. I also thought about how people like him believed they were untouchable until the right piece of paper landed in the right inbox. Kelly wandered in, mug of tea in hand. "You've been busy," she said, eyeing the spread of documents. "Just making sure I understand the lay of the land," I said, stacking the papers neatly. She raised an eyebrow. "That look on your face, that's not curiosity. That's a plan." I smiled, not confirming or denying. Some things are better left unspoken, at least for now. The truth was, I wasn't just holding the cards, I was holding the rule book, and Clive had broken more than one. So I slid the envelope into my desk drawer, unturned the key, and locked it. No one would see these until it mattered. Because the only thing more dangerous than proof is proof in the hands of someone who knows exactly when to use it. By the time I got back from the zoning office, the winter light was already starting to fade, turning the street into a strip of gray and gold. That was fine. Low light hides intentions. I grabbed my DSLR from the hall closet, the one I used to use for architectural shoots. The tripod legs clicked open with a familiar rhythm as I set it up at the back edge of my property. First shot. The garage from the corner, the jagged line where fresh concrete met frozen ground. Zoomed in so you could count the pores in the cement. Second shot, a wider angle, showing my weathered fence and where it should have met empty sky, not the wall of Clive's ego. I circled around, careful to stay on my own land, every click of the shutter sounding like a gavel in my mind. North angle, west angle, even a shot from my upstairs guest room window, catching the way his foundation footing practically swallowed the drainage strip whole. I wasn't just building a case, I was constructing a timeline. Next came the video. I switched to my phone. Better for showing movement, better for capturing that slow pan from survey stake to garage wall. December 23rd, I said aloud as I started recording. Temperature 34 degrees. Property line marked at original survey stake. Note the 7-foot encroachment into easement. The wind carried faint music from Clive's garage speakers, some bass-heavy track meant to impress guests. I kept walking, narrating distances, angling the camera to include my boots next to the survey stake, then pulling back to show the wall looming over me. The video ended with a clean sweep across the stormwater strip, bare except for the concrete that shouldn't have been there. Inside, I plugged the camera and phone into my desktop. Each file got labeled and time-stamped. I saved them twice, once on the hard drive, once on a USB stick that I tossed into my safe. I even printed a few of the clearer shots and slid them into a binder. Paper has a way of outlasting excuses. Then I went online and pulled up the county's GIS portal, overlaying the official property line maps onto satellite images. There it was again, the clean, authoritative red line cutting across the lot. and Clive's garage sitting well past it like an uninvited guest refusing to leave. Screenshot. Save. Duplicate to USB. I was halfway through organizing the files when Marla called. She'd been my go-to legal brain for years. Semi-retired now, but still sharp enough to dismantle most arguments in 3 sentences. "You sound busy," she said, skipping pleasantries. "Not busy," I corrected. "Thorough." "What's he done now?" I explained the 7 feet, the stormwater zone, the case precedents. I could almost hear her lean back in her chair, processing. "You know," she said finally, "once you start this, you can't stop. If you pull that trigger, it's going to go all the way. He'll fight it. You'll win, and he'll hate you forever. No friendly wave over the fence, no polite nods at HOA meetings. This will get ugly." I stared at the binder on my desk, the glossy photo of Clive's wall practically daring me to act. "I won't need to stop," I said. And I meant it. Marla sighed. The sound of someone who's seen too many people think they're ready for a fight until the first letter from a lawyer arrives. "Just remember, the best case is airtight. No gaps, no assumptions. You want them to fold before they even draft a counter." "That's the plan," I said. After we hung up, I went back to the binder, adding a page with the stormwater regulations printed in bold, highlighting the phrases non-permissible structures and subject to immediate removal. I included my notes in the margins, dates, map references, case file numbers. By midnight, the binder had weight. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a wrecking ball wrapped in vinyl covers. I sat back in my chair, the glow from the desk lamp pooling over the photos. Outside, the garage lights were still on. I pictured Clive inside, polishing chrome, sipping whatever overpriced whiskey he used to impress people. What he didn't know was that the walls around him were already numbered, and I was the one holding the chalk. It was one of those cold, brittle mornings when the air feels like it's waiting for something to break. I sat at my kitchen table, binder open, coffee cooling beside me. The photos, the maps, the timestamps, all lined up like soldiers before inspection. I'd gone over them twice already, not because I doubted their accuracy, but because I wanted every detail fresh in my mind. The number for city zoning enforcement was already written on a sticky note. Under it, in block letters, I'd written a single name: Inspector Rivera. Marla had mentioned him years ago when he'd shut down a developer for paving over a protected creek bed. "He doesn't bluff," she told me. That was exactly what I needed. I dialed. 2 rings. Then a crisp, almost bored voice. "Zoning Enforcement Rivera." "Inspector," I began, keeping my tone level. "My name's Elliot Ward. I believe I have a case you'll want to review personally." There was a faint pause, the kind reserved for people deciding whether to hand you off to a junior clerk. I didn't give him the chance. 7-foot encroachment onto my property, I continued, into a registered stormwater control zone. Concrete structure, garage, completed in the last 3 months. I have full photographic documentation, dated video evidence, and official county property line overlays, all time-stamped, all consistent. That caught him. His voice shifted, losing the routine cadence. "Stormwater zone, you said?" "Yes, sir. Lot 14, map 223B, section 4. The encroachment is not only on private property, but directly in violation of easement regulations. Structure sits squarely over the drainage strip, which, as you know, is a protected buffer." The sound of typing came through the line, fast and precise. "You have documentation?" he asked. "A complete package. High-resolution photos from multiple angles, survey stake measurements, GPS coordinates, official zoning maps, and copies of relevant code sections, plus 3 case precedents where smaller violations resulted in full demolition orders." Rivera let out a slow breath. "Mr. Ward, are you telling me you've already done our groundwork?" "I'm telling you, I can hand you a binder that would hold up in front of a judge tomorrow," I replied. There was another pause, but it wasn't hesitation this time. It was the quiet kind of calculation that happens when someone starts seeing the edges of a bigger picture. "What's the value of the structure?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. "Approximately 6.5 million. And my neighbor has no idea he's sitting on a violation that could invalidate his permits entirely." That did it. The shift in his tone was undeniable now. The easygoing government formality was gone, replaced by something sharper. "Mr. Ward," Rivera said, "we'll be there Monday morning." It wasn't a suggestion. I leaned back in my chair, watching sunlight creep across the kitchen floorboards. "I'll have the documentation ready," I told him. "Good," he replied. "And one more thing, don't mention this to anyone. If there's even a whisper, they'll try to cover it before we arrive. We like to see things untouched." "I understand." We hung up, and I stared at the silent phone for a moment. There was no rush of adrenaline, no triumphant grin. Just the steady awareness that I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Outside, across the property line, Clive's garage doors were open. He was inside, moving between his cars, wiping them down like each one was a museum piece. He glanced toward my house once, sunglasses reflecting the pale winter sun, and gave me a nod, the smug kind that says I'm untouchable. I nodded back. What he didn't know was that a man named Rivera now had his address, his coordinates, and a Monday morning slot blocked off in his calendar. I closed the binder and slid it into my messenger bag, ready for delivery. The whole thing felt oddly quiet. No dramatic music, no public confrontation, just a call made at the right time to the right person. If Clive thought silence meant surrender, he was about to learn that silence in the right hands is just the sound before demolition. Monday morning arrived colder than expected, the kind of crisp, brittle air that makes sound carry farther than it should. I was already on my porch at 8:45, coffee in hand, binder at my side. At exactly 9, the rumble of a diesel engine broke the stillness, and a white city zoning enforcement truck rolled slowly down our street. It stopped right in front of my driveway. Rivera stepped out first, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 younger inspectors carrying long tape measures and bright orange survey stakes. They looked exactly how you'd expect government enforcers to look. Plain jackets, neutral expressions, the calm energy of people who hold the authority to decide if something stands or falls. "Mr. Ward," Rivera greeted me, shaking my hand with a firm grip. His eyes scanned the property line before resting briefly on the hulking gray wall of Clive's garage. "We'll start at the northwest corner." From the moment their boots hit the frost-covered grass, the atmosphere shifted. These weren't casual weekend surveyors. They moved with the slow precision of people building a case in real time. One inspector unrolled the tape measure along the official line, while the other marked every critical point with fluorescent stakes. Each number was called out, logged, and double-checked. I stayed out of their way, leaning on the porch railing, watching. By the time they reached the midpoint between my house and Clive's, the evidence was as obvious as the morning sun. The garage wall was sitting a clean, undeniable 7 feet over the line. And not just anywhere over the line, right in the middle of the stormwater easement. That's when Clive appeared, and he came barreling out of his front door like a man storming onto a stage he thought he owned, sunglasses on, phone in one hand. He didn't even look at me. "This is harassment," he barked, striding toward the inspectors. "You can't just show up on my property with your little tape measures. You people have nothing better to do." Rivera didn't flinch. He barely looked up from his clipboard as he replied, voice calm, almost bored. "Mr. Davis, we have a formal complaint supported by documentation. Your garage is built inside a regulated easement. That is a direct violation of municipal code." For the first time since I'd known him, Clive didn't have a quick comeback. The confident smirk he wore like a badge slipped for just a second. The smallest flicker of something I'd never seen in his expression before, panic. It was there and gone in less than a heartbeat, replaced by the defensive bluster he'd perfected. "Regulated easement? Please. This is just some property line squabble. I've been here 2 years, and no one's had a problem until he jabbed a finger in my direction, started whining." Rivera finally looked up at him fully, eyes flat, tone even. "Mr. Davis, this is not a neighbor dispute. This is a matter of compliance with city infrastructure law. The easement exists to ensure unobstructed stormwater flow. Your structure compromises that flow. We will be filing an immediate stop work order and notifying the Building Safety Division." One of the younger inspectors handed Clive a yellow form clipped to a carbon copy sheet. He didn't take it at first, just stared at it like it was something that might bite. When he finally snatched it, his hand was trembling slightly. I caught his eyes for the briefest second. There was no smile this time, no "what are you going to do about it?" Challenge. He knew exactly what was happening. The rest of the inspection continued in silence except for the measured calls of distances and the click of Rivera's pen. The tape stretched from stake to stake, each number further confirming the inevitable. When they were done, Rivera turned to me. "Mr. Ward, we'll file the formal violation report today. You'll receive a copy for your records. Enforcement hearings will be scheduled within the month." Then he looked back at Clive. "In the meantime, any continued use of this structure is prohibited. That includes storage, vehicle housing, or any modification work. Do you understand?" Clive's jaw was tight. "You're making a mistake." Rivera didn't blink. The mistake was pouring concrete in a protected zone. The city truck pulled away 15 minutes later, orange stakes still marking the line like silent witnesses. Clive stayed on his driveway, arms crossed, glaring at me as if he could undo the last hour by sheer will. I just finished my coffee, nodded once, and went back inside. Because the real demolition had already started, not with bulldozers or wrecking crews, but with tape measures, city codes, and the flicker of panic on a man's face when he realizes the ground under him isn't his at all. It came 3 days later. I was at my desk, sorting through invoices, when I saw the mail truck roll past the window and stop at Clive's house. Our mailboxes are side by side, so I caught the motion out of the corner of my eye. The carrier pulling out a thick envelope, slapping a bright green certified mail sticker onto the front, and walking up Clive's driveway. I didn't need to guess what it was. Sure enough, when I went to check my own mail an hour later, the letter was visible through Clive's storm door window, sitting unopened on the marble entry table he'd had delivered last spring. A single sheet of city letterhead sat behind the clear plastic return sleeve, just enough of the header visible to read, "Department of Zoning and Code Compliance." By the next morning, I saw him standing in his driveway with it in hand, the green sticker torn, the envelope folded and crumpled like it had been balled up and smoothed out again. He must have read it 5 times by then, looking for a loophole that wasn't there. I'd gotten my own courtesy copy in the mail, not certified but stamped for informational purposes. It was as blunt as it was final. Violation: construction of permanent structure within regulated municipal stormwater easement without approved variance or permit. Applicable code: Municipal Code Section 14.2.17 and Section 18.6.04. Mandated action: demolition of all non-compliant portions of the structure within 45 calendar days of notice issuance. Penalties: failure to comply will result in fines of $1,000 per day until demolition is complete and site is restored to approved specifications. Reading it, I could almost hear Rivera's steady, unshakable voice in my head. The notice didn't mince words about why this was happening. The combination of property encroachment and interference with a designated stormwater drainage easement left no legal wiggle room. The fact that the structure was nearly complete didn't matter. The law was the law. The fines clause was almost poetic, $1,000 a day stacking like bricks in reverse, each one dismantling the thing he'd tried to build. That afternoon, Clive came to my fence. He didn't lean over it the way he usually did when he wanted to look intimidating. This time, he stayed a couple of feet back, letter still in his hand, eyes narrowed but voice lower than I'd expected. "You know about this?" he asked, waving the envelope like it was a piece of junk mail. "I got my copy," I said simply. He gave a short laugh, one of those hollow, humorless ones. "They're saying demolition. That's insane. This is a $6.5 million build. You don't just tear that down over a... what? A drainage strip?" "It's not just a drainage strip," I said. "It's a regulated easement. You built where you weren't allowed. They enforce those rules for a reason." His jaw tightened. "I'm appealing. I'll get a variance. My attorney says..." I cut him off before he could finish. Good luck. He didn't like that. He muttered something under his breath and walked off. Over the next week, I watched his emergency appeal process unfold in real time. If unfold is the right word for something that never really stood a chance. He hired a zoning lawyer, filed paperwork marked urgent in red letters, and even brought in a so-called stormwater engineer to argue that his structure didn't significantly interfere with runoff. But the city's response was as quick as it was decisive. Appeal denied. Variance request does not meet minimum criteria for exception under Section 14.2.17b. Non-compliance remains subject to immediate enforcement. Translation: nice try, but no. When Rivera's office posted the notice of mandatory demolition in bright orange plastic on the side of Clive's garage 2 days later, it was visible from halfway down the block. You couldn't miss it. The word demolition in bold black letters, the compliance deadline printed like a countdown clock. Neighbors slowed down when they drove past. Some stopped entirely, staring from their cars like it was a spectacle. From my porch, I watched Clive rip the notice off the wall and crumple it into a ball. But no matter how hard he crushed it in his fist, the deadline still existed, the fines still loomed, and the law still stood. He'd told me once, months ago, that he didn't lose, that losing was for other people. Now, with the clock ticking and the walls closing in, literally, I wondered how it felt for him to realize he was just another person after all. It's funny how quickly the wind changes in a neighborhood. For 2 years, Clive had been the gravitational pull of our little cul-de-sac, the man with the imported champagne at HOA mixers, the one who could convince the board to overlook violations for the right people, the host of endless driveway soirees with gleaming Lamborghinis parked like centerpieces. People who barely tolerated him still showed up, if only to bask in the reflected glow of money and noise. But after the orange demolition notice went up, the tone shifted like a string snapping. It started small. The neighbor across the street, Linda, a woman who once bragged about how Clive let her teenage son test drive one of his sports cars in the name of mentorship, stopped waving when she saw him. Then, at the weekly HOA meeting, I noticed something remarkable. The chairs Clive usually commanded in the center were empty. The same board members who once leaned toward him like plants toward the sun now avoided making eye contact. Word spreads faster than an electrical fire in a place like this. By the end of the week, there were whispers at every mailbox. $6.5 million for a garage, I overheard someone murmur to a neighbor while collecting their mail. It's not just a garage, the other replied, lowering her voice. It's a car temple, climate control, imported cedar from Japan, Italian marble flooring. I heard it cost more than most houses on this street combined. I didn't have to feed the rumor mill. It ran on its own. In the small community Facebook group, the one where people usually posted about lost cats or who had the best chili at the block party, the coded comments began. Someone posted a photo of a wrecking ball from a construction meme page with the caption, "Coming soon to a driveway near you." Another added a photo of Venice during high tide, with the line, "If only someone had respected the stormwater easement." It was petty, it was relentless, and I didn't touch a single part of it. I'd learned long ago that silence is more dangerous than shouting. If you argue, you give your opponent something to push back against. But if you say nothing, you give them nothing to grab, just enough space for their own weight to pull them down. So I stayed quiet. In public, I didn't gloat. I didn't correct the rumors or add details, even though I had plenty. When Marla asked if I felt tempted to set the record straight, I just shook my head. "The city's already speaking for me," I told her. "They're a louder voice than I could ever be." It helped that Rivera and her team moved quickly. Every visit to Clive's property was another reminder to the neighbors that this wasn't personal gossip. It was official. The sight of city trucks and clipboard-carrying inspectors trudging up his driveway had a way of underscoring the seriousness. By mid-month, even the people who used to park themselves in his backyard for hours on weekends were nowhere to be seen. The music stopped. The driveway was empty. One evening, I saw him standing alone in his garage doorway, staring at the cars inside like they were museum pieces he'd been told he couldn't touch. The bright lights he'd once left on for the whole street to admire were now dim. That was the other thing. The garage had always been a performance. Even before the easement violation came to light, Clive made sure you could see the polished floors from the road, the subtle mist of climate control vapor when the doors slid open. It was a statement. I can build something bigger than your house just to store my toys. But now, that statement had been rewritten by the city's notice. Instead of power, people saw arrogance. Instead of wealth, they saw waste. The most telling moment came at the grocery store. I was in the produce aisle when I spotted Mark, one of Clive's old poker buddies. He caught my eye and said, Guess you were right to keep your lot lines tight. He didn't say Clive's name, but he didn't have to. That's when I knew the social tide had turned for good. Once the murmurs start in public, the fall is already underway. And the best part, I hadn't lifted a finger. The rumble of diesel engines reached me before I saw them. From my porch, coffee mug warm between my palms, I watched the city trucks roll in just after 7 a.m. They were not in a hurry. Men in safety vests, stepping out, stretching, running gloved hands along the metal sides of the excavators like they were greeting old friends, but there was purpose in the way they moved. Across the street, Clive's driveway looked like the set of a disaster movie waiting for its first act. The garage, his monument to himself, stood quiet, doors shut, no cars in sight. It almost looked abandoned, except for the way the morning light caught the imported cedar siding. I knew those planks had been shipped across the Pacific at some absurd cost, each one chosen for its tone consistency. That's what Clive bragged about at the last HOA barbecue before the notice hit. Now those same planks were just coordinates in a demolition plan. The crew chief, a square-jawed man with a clipboard, spoke with Inspector Rivera for less than a minute. No ceremony, no drama. Rivera pointed at the garage, tapped her paperwork, and stepped aside. This wasn't a negotiation. The city had already denied every appeal, every frantic motion Clive's lawyers had filed. Today was the end point. I could see him now. Clive, standing on his own porch in a rumpled polo shirt, hair uncombed. He wasn't yelling. That surprised me. Just standing there, arms crossed, staring at the excavator like he could will it to stop. His wife was nowhere to be seen. The car temple was empty. The first blow came at 7:42. The excavator's arm swung forward, bucket teeth catching the upper edge of the garage wall. The cedar splintered with a sound that was almost like a tree snapping in a storm, sharp, abrupt, final. A shiver went down my spine. There's something surreal about watching months of arrogance crumble in seconds. The wall folded inward, hitting the polished marble floor with a thud I could feel through the ground. The crew didn't pause. The excavator pivoted, took another bite, and more of the wall disintegrated. Clive shifted his stance, but still didn't speak. Maybe he knew shouting wouldn't help him now. Maybe he didn't trust his voice to come out steady. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the steam fog my glasses for a second before lowering the mug. The bitterness of the roast seemed sharper this morning. When the roof went, it happened almost gracefully. The excavator pulled at the trusses until they gave way, sagging, then collapsing in a sudden rush. Sunlight poured through the gap, cutting long beams through the rising dust cloud. That moment, dust and light tangled together, caught me off guard. For just a second, it didn't feel like vengeance. It felt like nature reclaiming something. The smell of cedar and concrete dust drifted across the street. A fine grit settled on my porch railing on the brim of my mug. I set the coffee down and just watched. The marble flooring, once Clive's proudest feature, shattered under the treads of the machinery. The climate-controlled ducts, the recessed LED lighting strips, the imported shelving, all of it bent and twisted into unrecognizable shapes. An hour in, the garage was no longer a structure. It was a pile. Neighbors had gathered in twos and threes, pretending to walk dogs or water lawns. Nobody spoke loudly, but the air buzzed with the kind of quiet attention you see at a fireworks show right before the finale. By 10 a.m., the last of the cedar siding was hauled into a dumpster. The excavators pushed the debris into neat mounds for the haulers. Rivera signed off on her clipboard and gave the crew chief a nod. Clive turned and went inside without looking back. I stayed where I was, finishing the last swallow of coffee gone lukewarm. The sun had climbed high enough to burn away the dust, leaving the lot bare. No marble, no cedar, no climate-controlled shrine to wealth. Just a scar in the dirt where the garage had stood, and the stormwater drainage path re-exposed like a healed bone under the skin. It struck me then, the city didn't just remove a building, they erased a statement, and the street felt quieter for it. By the time summer settled in, the street had a different rhythm. The noise from across the road, the revving engines, the late-night construction drills, the bass-heavy music that rattled window panes, was gone. The only sound now was the wind pushing through the open space where Clive's garage had once stood. It was strange how quickly silence could reclaim a place. Clive didn't make a public announcement, didn't throw a moving sale, didn't stand on his driveway bragging about his latest remodel anymore. Instead, Little signs began to appear. The first came 2 weeks after the demolition. A flatbed truck arrived early one morning, loaded with 2 of his prized sports cars. Not the cheap ones either. These were the ones he used to photograph for the HOA newsletter cover, the ones with engines that purred like big cats. I stood at my porch railing, coffee in hand, and watched the driver secure them with heavy straps before pulling away. The second sign came a month later. A for sale sign appeared in his yard, discreet, angled slightly toward the house so you couldn't see it from down the block unless you were looking. I didn't need to read the fine print to know what it meant. The legal fees, the fines, the cost of losing the garage, they had drained him. By the 3rd month, Clive's household had gone almost completely silent. His wife stopped hosting her weekend brunches. The constant stream of guests dried up. The driveway was empty more often than not. Then on a Tuesday morning, the moving vans arrived. There was no farewell wave, no final glare in my direction, just men in uniforms carrying furniture to the truck, loading box after box. I didn't even see Clive until the last hour, standing in the shadow of the open van, hands in his pockets. When he climbed into his own car, the only one left, and pulled away, he didn't look back. 3 months earlier, he had stood in that same driveway and told me, "Nobody cares about 7 feet." Now, those 7 feet were green again. The city had sent in their own crew after the demolition to restore the stormwater easement. The drainage channel was cleared, lined with fresh gravel, and reseeded with grass. By late August, it had taken root, a clean strip of green running like a scar between our properties. I walked it some mornings, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a line reclaimed. One evening, as the sun was setting and the grass seemed to glow against the darker yard around it, Marla stopped by. She leaned on my porch railing, her hair caught in the wind, and looked across the street at the empty house. "Was it worth it?" she asked. Her tone wasn't judgmental, more curious, like she'd been holding the question for weeks. I thought about the long process, the surveying, the zoning office visits, the documentation, the phone call to Rivera. I thought about the mornings I'd woken to the sound of power tools on the wrong side of my property line, the way Clive had smirked like my silence was surrender. "Every measured inch," I said. Marla smiled faintly, the kind of smile that says she understood more than she let on, and turned to head home. I stayed on the porch a while longer, watching the wind bend the young grass over the stormwater strip. It wasn't just about winning. It was about proof. That the line mattered. That arrogance had consequences, that some boundaries are worth defending no matter how small they seem on paper. The neighborhood would move on. Someone else would buy Clive's house. Maybe they'd build their own garage one day. But I doubted they'd forget where the property line was. As the streetlights flickered on and the crickets started up, I took one last look at that restored strip and felt the quiet settle in. The fight was over. The line was mine again, and I intended to keep it that way. The air was still when I stepped outside, the kind of stillness you only get before the rest of the world wakes up. The sky wasn't fully lit yet, just streaks of pale gold brushing against the deep blue, the first soft pull of sunrise over the rooftops. I wrapped my jacket tighter and walked down the porch steps, my boots finding the familiar crunch of dew-frosted grass. The stormwater strip stretched ahead of me like a quiet reminder. The new grass, greener than anything else on my property, caught the light in a way that made it almost glow. I walked slowly along it, each step deliberate, letting the memory of what had been here replay in my mind. 7 feet. That was all it was. 7 feet of soil, stone, and roots. But also 7 feet of respect, of legal ground, of principle. It was the difference between my land and someone else's arrogance. The morning felt cleaner now, freer. There was no hulking wall throwing a shadow across the line, no faint smell of motor oil drifting from Clive's so-called car temple, just space, open and right. I stopped halfway down the strip and let my hand brush the grass tops, the moisture clinging to my fingers. The sun caught the curve of my palm, and for a moment I thought about how easy it would have been to let it go, to shrug it off as just 7 feet. That was what Clive counted on, people folding because it was easier than fighting. But I hadn't fought for the 7 feet alone. I'd fought for the idea that no one gets to take what isn't theirs just because they think they can. I thought back to the first day I saw that concrete wall pushed past the line. Clive had been leaning against his sports car, smirk in place, tossing that question at me like it was a joke. "What are you going to do about it?" He'd said it like the answer was nothing. He was wrong. The process hadn't been quick. It hadn't been easy. It had been a dozen small, deliberate steps, each one backed by patience and proof. The maps, the photos, the call to Rivera, the inspection, the notice, the demolition. Every part of it had been measured, precise, not in anger, but in certainty. I reached the end of the strip and turned, looking back toward my house. The early light hit the porch just right, casting long shadows across the yard. I could hear the faint rattle of Marla's wind chimes down the block, the chirp of a single bird somewhere behind me. Peace, not just in the sound, but in knowing the fight was over. And I'd won it on my terms. Some people think winning is about shouting the loudest. For me, it was about never raising my voice at all. Letting the right people speak for me. Letting the law, not ego, draw the line. I walked back the way I came, my boots leaving a faint trail in the wet grass. Each step felt like closure, not just for this fight, but for every time I'd let someone push a little too far into my space, my patience, my life. When I reached the porch, I turned one last time, letting my eyes trace that clean boundary. The grass moved in the light breeze, steady, unbroken. I faced the camera then, the invisible one in my mind, the audience I'd been telling this story to all along, and spoke the only words that felt right. If someone stole 7 feet of your land, would you let it go, or measure every inch and take it back? The sun rose fully behind me, casting my shadow long over the line, and just like that, the day began.